Under Finance Fund Balances, Senate Bill 111, passed by the 2011 legislature, permits districts to transfer funds from selected special revenue or restricted funds to the general fund for the 2011-12 school year. An explanation of the purpose of fund balances and the planned usage of June 30th, 2011 fund balances will be given. This item is for the board's discussion and/or appropriate action.
All right, I want to thank the board for the opportunity tonight. As we started our budget conversation really in December, one of the efforts that both the board supported and that we planned was the continual peeling back of our budget, the process, having those public conversations. We've had multiple conversations here at the board table. We've had community meetings, budget stakeholders meetings, all of which have been available to the public. As we looked at our revenues, we looked at expenditures, and then as we prepare for discussion of a recommended budget for the board to discuss in its entirety on the 18th, and then for approval, there are a couple other components that we needed to talk about to get a full picture. The topic that I want to cover tonight is as we take a look at our year-end cash balances, which were addressed earlier this evening, as well as our cash flow issues and how we work through those and include that as part of the budgeting process. So that is the intent. Again, this is part of our plan cycle as we take a look and discuss our budget. A couple highlights that I'll touch on tonight are the role of cash balances in the district budget. This is not contrary to some belief, just extra money that is there for use. It is critical to our cash flow throughout the year, as well as an overall budgeting approach as we look not at 1 year, but several years in our budget thought process. The impact of SB 111, the new legislation, what flexibilities that has given us and how the recommendation includes using some of that limited flexibility, and then the implications for the 11-12 budget. Again, trying to dispel that myth that the district's unwilling to use fund balances, to talk about the total cash balance of all our operating funds as we look from year to year has already been reduced by 8% from last year, and then to address our contingency reserve, which is about 8 days of operating cash. Well, that seems like a great deal of money when you put it in perspective of how many days of operating cash is that. That's pretty limited. As we started building the budget and having that discussion, we talked about where did we receive our funds. This diagram is not intended to show the percentage. We used pie graphs for that in our early discussions, but to take a look at where do we receive our revenue through state aid, through federal aid, the local option budget or local property taxes, and then the budgeted use of fund balances on June 30th. When we take a look at some of these examples, you'll see that one of the issues that I think oftentimes goes under discussed, and that's as much our responsibility for the public, is the fluctuation in our revenue streams. If you were to make that comparison, if I held 3 part-time jobs and I receive from one pay on a monthly basis, from another on a quarterly basis, and another on an annual basis. That's how we have to look at our operations. It would be nice to have all funds in hand on July 1, and that changes the entire discussion. But that's not the way our revenues are received. We receive monthly, quarterly, and annually. For example, annually, when we think of special ed transportation, we receive that in the final quarter of the year. So our expenses have to be paid all year, with the reimbursement received then typically in June. At the same time, our paychecks don't always arrive on time. This past year, payments were late from the state 11 out of 12 times. They were late numerous times the year before, which is key as we think about our cash flow issues. Those margins grow ever narrower. If we're unable to manage that aspect, that really boils down to approximately 9,000 employees not being paid on time, us not being able to pay our bills, and being able to pay local businesses and others that we do business with. So the goal of the whole budget process, as we've walked through this, has been to find an equilibrium where we are looking at a solid budget planning process, that we really take a look at our revenues, our expenditures, and all of those areas, and develop a budget that provides the best educational opportunity for 50,000 students, but at the same time balance our responsibilities and your decisions as it applies to our taxpayers. We take a look at June 30 fund balance, which is one that's often quoted. I think we need to talk about that just a little bit. The district has 34 state-mandated funds. 3 are unrestricted: the general, local, option, and contingency reserve. Those are pretty straightforward. We've spent a lot of time discussing about the difference between restricted and unrestricted funds, and the remainder are restricted in some format or another. What you'll actually see, though, on many of the state reports is 25 funds reported, because the state requires textbooks and student revolving materials, fees paid by parents for textbooks, for music, instrument rental, student fees. All of those are lumped into one fund. Bonds that have been sold that are held in order to pay for the bond plan that was approved by our community are not represented in the year-end reports in the budget book. And then the special reserve fund, which is a bit of a misnomer. There are just a few school districts that have self-funded health and workers' compensation funds. That's we are one of those. So the special reserve fund is the category that's used on the state reports, but that is the district health insurance and workers' compensation. When we take a look at the role of those fund balances, the financial activity in these funds is used throughout the year to support budgeted expenditures and our cash flow issue. Unencumbered cash does not mean funds that are idle. We budget those carryovers as the end of year balance in each of those funds for ongoing operations. As I said, it doesn't mean extra money. If these funds are depleted permanently, then that would require significant cuts in budgeted expenditures. What's reported as June 30 balance is only a point-in-time measure, and that changes dramatically as the year progresses. So, for example, if you received your paycheck in your account and somebody looked at how much money you had in your bank account having received the paycheck and no expenditures coming out of it, that would give a very different picture compared to after expenditures have come out, particularly when you keep in mind how we receive those revenues in and out on various basis. That's one of our high points because of end-of-year cash balances as well as property tax distribution. If you take a look, say, at special education, that fund balance in the 30th, the end of June 2010, was about $12.5 million. By December, you could see a significant decrease, because we have to make sure that the balances there cover the expenses through the first part of the school year. The district will not receive any reimbursement for special education until October. So even with the October payment, you could see how the ebb and flow occurs. Then again, in January, we receive the next property tax disbursement as well as the special ed funds from state and throughout the year from federal. And I gave the example earlier of the transportation from special education that we have really a full year of expenses before we receive the reimbursement. So as you can see, those balances carried us through those periods without the revenue stream. Another way to take a look at this is to think about your home escrow fund. Each month, as you make your house payment, there's typically included a portion that goes for insurance and property taxes. And you build that balance over the year. So if you look at the snapshot of each of those months, that balance is going to look different. If you borrow from that escrow account to pay for a credit card or college tuition or your utilities, one of two things really have to happen. You need to know that there's a revenue stream that will help replenish that escrow account. Or when you've borrowed from another part of your budget that you're willing to do without in that portion. In a home situation, you might even be able to take out a line of credit. School districts cannot do that. So we really have the two options that we either borrow from other accounts or we have some revenue stream that we know is going to help replace those accounts. So if the snapshot you took was the day before your escrow payment is due, your balance is going to look significant. If you look at it the day after the payment is, that balance is going to look minimal. And that's the same as you look at our cash flow and our balances as the year progresses. Now, SB 111 has been a topic of conversation. It was passed toward the end of the legislative session. It allows for 12 funds to have some temporary flexibility for a period of 1 year in order to make up some of the funding cuts by the Kansas legislature. So that amount is limited to what we lost due to the state funding cuts, or $232 per student. Some earlier comments, and we've had in past meetings individuals that have addressed the board that have used numbers of 45 million, 100 million, various numbers. That is, and then accredited SB 111 with the ability to utilize that money, regardless of the concept that those funds are budgeted or part of cash flow aspects. The cap put into SB 111 in those funds is about $16.4 million. So it's not tens or even 100+ million as some have attested. At the same time, when we look at those funds, while there may have been granted legislatively temporary flexibility, we still have other limitations and requirements. For example, on special education, the maintenance of effort is similar for a school district just as it is for the state, in which unless we've had a sizable reduction in student population or we've had a significant number of students that were receiving very intensive and expensive services, our support of special education is not supposed to be less next year compared to this year. That's one of the issues that the state wrangled with and was a key piece in their budget discussions, was the state's portion of maintenance of effort. Because without that, the qualification and to receive the federal dollars was impacted. And that's one of the twists that occurred toward the end of the session, was the state moving as part of the budget process to guarantee that the MOE on the state portion would not jeopardize future federal funds. We also have parent paid fees for specific purposes. They've paid for textbook, instrument rental, athletics. Those are fees that as a board you have established and are part of that enrollment process, and specifically state what the fee will be used for. We really have other areas in which we have mandates, those wonderful unfunded mandates, in which there are no revenue or potential funds to replace those. Perfect example that I've given here is professional development. Professional development is still a statute. So really I look at this one in two different ways. One, it's a statutory requirement. There's only one time, I believe, in the last decade in which the state has funded their obligated portion of the professional development requirement. In the last several years, there's been absolutely no financial support of that area. But more key to that is the continuing ongoing professional development is necessary for us to work towards meeting the ever-increasing standards by which we're held accountable. That increase in 4 and 5% in literacy and math means we have to do things differently in the classroom. We have to continue to develop skill sets that will help our students reach those goals. So regardless of the statutory aspect, that's a cost of doing business. And when we take a look at the SB 111 provisions, I want to break this out into, into two sections. Excuse me. The first, we'll take a look at 8 of the 12 funds that are included in SB 111. The 4-year-old program, early childhood, bilingual, which is both required at by the state and federal level. eSchool. eSchool is one that we've seen some increased enrollment. Actually, this year, due to an accounting requirement, you will see that we have to account for funds received directly in relation to eSchool under that eSchool account. So it will appear as though there's $1 million additional dollars. Those are not new dollars, and I'll hit on that again in the moment. But that we have to show them there, and then as we've done in the past, transfer that money for other areas. Driver's education. This is one where SB 111 really did assist us. As you'll remember, in last year's cuts, we eliminated driver's education. So without the flexibility provided under this bill, the funds that were in the driver's education would have sat there for basically ever until we reinstated the program, because those were restricted funds. This will allow us, as we had planned to do, to sweep that account and to utilize those funds. Already addressed professional development. Parents as teachers, as part of the budget recommendation, there were reductions made in parents as teachers. There were some grant carryovers that parents as teachers had received, so the budget recommendation was not to include general fund dollars in support. Parents as teachers receive state matching funds for the local contribution, so they will utilize those grant funds in able to get the state match. If they're unable to continue to find those outside dollars in the next budget, then that program would continue to provide service. Summer school for Wichita the last several years, we've looked at as a revenue neutral, in that we expect the revenues received through tuition and other areas offset the actual costs of the program. And then vocational funding. That's a combined balance of these 8 funds, just to show you that cash flow from June 30th to December 31st dropped by about 67%. So you could see what that looked like from June 30th 10 to December 31st 10. And I note there that if you took the driver's ed funds out, that balance would actually be about $179,000, because that was included in those 2010. We didn't have the flexibility under SB 111. Again, as we take a look at walking through those balances, you could see how they ebb and flow as our cash flow changes from month to month. Now, of the 4 remaining funds covered under SB 111, that's about 94% of the balance in the 12 funds. So these are really the largest of those 12 funds. When we take a look at the first, it was at-risk funds. At-risk funds predominantly have been utilized by the district to fund teachers in classrooms, to provide extra tutorial support. They've been geared toward instruction. The at-risk funding mechanism was part of the last litigation under Montoy, in which the state was found to be lacking in its support of students at greatest risk and need. So the funds that are allocated for that purpose are put toward meeting the needs of those students. Textbooks and student revolving funds, again, these are predominantly parent paid fees, and that we've explained to our parents when they pay those fees that they'll be used for that stated purpose. Again, that includes a number of not only materials but instrument rentals and the others. The textbook fund itself is one that we have to absolutely look long term, because the cycle of textbooks adoptions, originally the district goal was to look at a 5-year replacement cycle. That's now been pushed with budgetary considerations to 6 and 8 years. A district our size, when you look at replacing those materials, that can be very expensive. The fees we receive do not come close to covering the cost of textbook replacement cycles. So we know that that fund has to build over time. For example, when the elementary math series was adopted, that was over $5 million in just that adoption. Elementary reading series, which the board approved, was a little over $1 million. So that you know, when you look at large-scale adoptions, and each year we've spent in what I would call large scale, when you're talking full curricular areas, about $1.4 million roughly in budgeted. This past spring, we've looked at replacing a number of the vocational materials, and you'll see ESOL in some of those. But as we look at what that multi-year plan looks like, you can see that as we approach a secondary math adoption, we're talking probably somewhere in the range of $7 million. When we're looking at a language arts adoption, you're talking in that $5 to $8 million range. So we have to think of it in not year, but years, and know that we're building that. It's much like buying a car and knowing you have to pay cash for it. So you can't just decide the year before you want to buy that car that I'm going to have the cash to do that. You have to plan that out, and that's what we try to do. The cost of textbooks continue to increase, even though there are electronic options available. That's not the complete answer. Not only is there a cost to providing the technology that's necessary, it's not something that our students all have access to. So I don't see textbooks disappearing anytime in the near future until they roll out a $50 iPad or something like that. We're going to be looking at adopting textbooks for the next 5 to 10 years at least. Special education, again, we don't receive our first state reimbursement until October, so we need to make sure that we have balances required to cover the salaries for our special ed. This is an area that you will see some increase in the ending fund balance. Part of that occurred because of, or occurred predominantly because of the decisions made by the legislature at the tail end of the session to meet the maintenance of effort requirement. So we had budgeted what we had been advised to by KSDE on what the teacher and para reimbursement would be, and when the additional funding was received, they had to make sure the funds got credited to this year in order not to jeopardize the maintenance of effort. So there was some increase there. It's also why, as we talked previously around our budget, that will allow us not to make, for the first time in quite some time, a general ed transfer into special education. That doesn't happen very often because what we receive doesn't cover the cost of providing the required services as required by IEP, federal and state law. Contingency reserve, as I touched on earlier, is close as we get to a district savings account. That has not been an area that why it's included. The board has always had discretion and has utilized those funds over the last several years, utilizing it in the budget recommendations for next year. And really, as we take a look at how do we utilize these funds over the next several budgets, we know that there's a key responsibility when it comes to utilizing these fund balances in support of our 2011 and 2012. Now, one of the areas that we haven't talked about for quite some time is the local option budget. This is always one that early on is tough to project, just because it isn't until July 1 that we receive final confirmation. So let's take a look at our LOB and how that also impacts how we built this budget. When you look at the LOB, that's of course the property tax. It's the funding source for districts. Wichita is at the 30%. There is a state aid or equalization to the local option budget. And the concept behind that is you have very divergent abilities of districts to raise funds based on what a mill will raise in that particular district. So, for example, you have what I would consider or call a property poor district that one mill will raise $17 per student in the district, and you have another district that mill will raise $526, I believe was on the high end. So you can imagine the gap in between those districts. So part of the intent behind the LOB state aid is to not have a student's zip code define what's contained in that LOB, and that's supplemental aid for school districts. The legislature capped the funding for LOB this year, and what that means is it's going to result in a proration of state aid for 11-12. So why the valuations have changed, you've seen more districts that would qualify within the formula for the potential of that aid. The amount of dollars spent is capped. The difference for Wichita is estimated at about $3.5 million. You can see on this as a percentage goes up or a percentage goes down. When we take a look at assessed valuation, it has an impact on the LOB aspect. Sedgwick County anticipates that the tax collections will be down about 0.6%, and that delinquencies will be up about 1%. So when you take that into consideration and how that affects the LOB formula, that would be a shortfall of about $1.6 million. Now, as we built that budget, the assumption was going to be, when you looked at the last several years, assessed valuation had been down, delinquencies in tough economic times had increased. The issue was just how large a gap would that be. You can also see if assessed valuation goes up, there would be some potential on the positive direction. But that was the information we received July 1. And it's important that as we look at that has an impact on the budget and the cash flow considerations that have to be made. 2011 and 12, we are using cash balances. We're doing that in a limited, but I think fiscally responsible way to help balance the 11-12 budget. As I said from the very beginning, we cannot fall into the trap of just contemplating a budget based on what is right at hand in front of us, because those are the types of decisions that both at the federal and state level have put us in many of the financial issues that we currently face. That as we look at what's the conversation around next year's budget as well, you've got the current budget, $200 million of it was a loan from the highway fund, which the governor has said will not occur in the next budget. You have a 1-cent sales tax sunsetting in 2014. You have Medicaid expenditures. The governor's budget director, I believe, the last I heard, was anticipating $70 million more caseload cost per year. You look at all those aspects, you look at none of that is talking about increased revenue, it's talking about areas that will impact the overall state budget. So in addition to the recommendations that you see here as we look at those balances, that we would sweep the entire driver's ed fund balance, $1 million transfer from the virtual education fund balance, and being able to utilize that $3.5 million from the special education fund balance. This is on top of the recommendations previously made in the budget process to use $2 million from the contingency reserve fund. And that has allowed us, as we look at these uses, to be able to reduce our cuts below the projected 30+ million to the 27.8. Now, in conclusion, as planned, cash balances are being used. As I've told you in the early stages of our budget discussion, I think that they will have to continue to be used over the next couple years. The turnaround in the economy and what that will mean for schools, I think is we've still got a couple tough years to go. Those balances, as were demonstrated in some of those areas, you could easily see how we need to have the cash flow to be able to operate and meet our payroll and our vendor payments as we move throughout the year, and also to cover, like last year, 11 out of 12 times when the state was late on their payments. That ripple effect to our employees and our vendors in the community and region would be significant. We saw some of the ripple just in the pause and study as we talked about the bond and what that did to many subcontractors and vendors. So we know what a larger aspect would do. The recommendation that I prepared for the board as we move through the budget process is conservative, but I think it's also responsible use of fund balances as we look not only at this year but to the future, but also as was discussed very early in the year, I bring a budget recommendation to you that keeps property taxes flat in 2011 and 12. And I know that was very important to the board, that given the current economic times that we not increase the tax burden on the local community. So with that said, I will take any questions.
Thank you very much, John. Lynn?
I do have a question, and then I've got some comments to remind the board and the public. If we're faced this coming year like we were last year with budget cuts in the middle of a school year because state revenues don't come in as planned. Last year we were planning to take those out of the contingency reserve fund. What would we do in this coming year?
We would have to look at contingency reserve. You also had, we really had a two-prong approach to that, knowing that most likely a cut was coming this year, but not knowing the size. If you'll remember, as we concluded the budget, the 1-cent sales tax was done at the very end of the session, and that we had some phase 3 cuts that we went ahead and moved forward with, knowing that that would give us a leg up on any mid-year cuts. That doesn't exist, excuse me, in this current budget proposal, so we'd have to look at either mid-year cuts, layoffs, or use of the contingency reserve.
And layoffs are difficult because of the contracts.
Because of the contract, and you're looking at a contingency reserve of, somewhere in that 8 to 9 days of operating cash. So it doesn't give you a great deal of leeway, depending on how long the gap would be between receiving revenues. Okay.
I guess one of the things I wanted to remind the board, also, some of us that have been on it will remember, but and we've been asked why have the funds gone up so much in the last 5 years, and I guess I just want to remind the board 2 things happened. One, we realized how low the contingency was, and what would happen, if we had to make mid-year cuts. This isn't the first time to the rodeo, so to speak. And then secondly, the legislature 2 years ago encouraged all school districts to put more money aside into the contingency, knowing that these days were coming. They're here, we're using it, but as a banker for 30 years, and particularly the bank that I work for, the term working capital is huge. And you have to have money to pay your bills. And, the general rule of thumb is 90 days of cash to be able to pay your bills. Now, not all companies can do that, so they can borrow, or they can have access to lines of credit. We don't have that flexibility. The bank that I worked for, actually back in 2008, during the upheaval of Wall Street, we actually had 180 days of cash on hand, knowing that we might need it if the bond markets were going to slow down. So I think the citizens need to realize how important working capital is, and 8 or 9 days is still not enough. And particularly when the state has been late 11 out of 12 months. And I guess I also wanted to remind individuals that we aren't the only government organization that does this. The city, at the end of their fiscal year, had $94 million, and again, that was comparable to what we have, for that 108 that's been quoted. It doesn't include capital, bond, those kinds of things. The county had 125 million. Their budgets are, give or take, in the same neighborhood as ours. And again, they use it for the same reason the state has that as well. Senate Bill 111 is not the silver bullet. It does help us a lot with the driver's ed funds, but again, it's a small dollar amount. We've been, as a board, criticized because of our state board member that came up and told us how much we could spend. And one of the reasons we disagree with our state board member is that he has used 5 or 6 different figures. And I have to give credit to KPI. Their 16.4 is one of the very first correct, on track target numbers that an organization has told. And so again, we can't use money that's been put in trust for other things. I mean, we can, and we end up in trouble. We have to remember, too, that the state, with the year-end balances, says we have $30 million they never sent us. And so, in non-government world, that would be called fraud. Now, I know Linda doesn't like that word, but that's something the state requires us to do. And there's a lot of, I would call them sometimes, games that the state makes us play, and they're made by the state. They're not our rules. We are simply following those rules. But I do want to make sure that every citizen knows that we take this very seriously. The funds that we have are handled professionally. We have probably one of the best auditing firms in the state in terms of public government, Allen Gibbs and Hulick, that is our auditor. They follow things very, very closely for us. Our staff follows it very, very closely. But there's not a silver bullet. This is just one part of the overall budget process. Funds are just part of it. And as I've said from day one, other than contingency, most of those funds have a use. They're already built into the budget, as we've seen tonight. And really, in my mind, a lot of Senate Bill 111 was efforts on the part of the Speaker to distract from the budget cuts that were going to be made on our per pupil funding. Now, others may not believe that or feel that way, but we don't have the same dollars in the general fund, and we've talked a lot about restricted and unrestricted. And I think overall our citizens understand that, and they see through the hype of a lot of the comments and hoopla that some of the folks that don't want to give us credit for doing the right thing here. And I do say managing our funds right and using it for cash flow purposes is beneficial. Without it, our taxes go up, our costs go up. Businesses would not extend us credit. They would not want us to sell us things because they didn't know if they were going to get paid. Employees' confidence, if they didn't get a paycheck on time or at all, would be horrendous. And then we would have individuals that are criticizing us now on funds coming back and saying we're poor stewards of our taxes. And I guess I would rather err, if I'm going to err, on integrity and on making sure that the dollars are there and they're used for what they say they're supposed to be used for. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Betty?
Okay, I'm going to simplify what I've heard. Senate Bill 111 allows us to rob Peter to pay Paul. Is there anything being hatched out for when Peter goes broke? Who are we supposed to rob then? I mean, there has to be something going on, so help me with that a little bit, if you will.
I guess you'd rob George.
Where's George?
Yeah.
We may need George.
George.
George,
No,
please stand up.
you're correct. Again, without the ability to replace those funds, the choice, with additional revenue, the choice becomes if you use funds from the 4-year-old program, you do not have those funds to provide those programs and services. So you're in that decision of, if I don't spend it here, I'm going to spend it there. You're correct.
One other question, and let's go back to the 11 out of 12 times that the state was late, and we didn't have any money from Peter, so to speak. Tell me exactly what would have happened.
Well, for example, when you look at the cash balance flow and we get into December and that payment is late, we've had to draw down to within a very low margin on our contingency reserve to be able to meet the monthly obligations. You're looking on a month, it's $36 million in salaries, $12 million in vendor payments. So if those funds are not there, you're unable to meet those obligations. So it would be a combination of not being able to issue paychecks, pay vendors, suppliers, service providers. I mean, they're all of those monthly expenditures that you see in the reports and that are part of us doing business. Decisions would have to be made on who got paid and who didn't.
And how long do you think it would take, following that same scenario, before we would end up having to close all of our schools again, if there was nothing in reserve that we could use?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I mean, we have, through the contingency reserve, 8 to 9 days of operating cash. That's not a question that's been posed, so I'd have to sit down with Lynn and we'd have to take a look at that. I really can't answer that one off the cuff.
All right. Thank you.
Cheryl.
Yes, I put my name on and off because I thought you were going to answer my question, but it's just a follow-up to what Betty asked about the contingency reserve with the 8 to 9 days. I know that the state's been late 11 out of 12 times, but how late is late? Are we within have they always been within that 8 or 9 days? No?
It's varied from month to month. What's been our longest period of time, Linda?
Over a month.
And there are times that we'll receive, I mean, we just got it in June, we'll receive, well, you're going to get a portion of your payment, say for special education now, and it'll be 10 days or 14 days or whatever until you receive that next portion. So it hasn't been a consistent, we're just waiting 5 days and then sending.
Right.
It's really fluctuated from, as Linda said, almost a month to, days. So that that occurs has a huge impact on us as well, on where are we in our revenue receipts. Where are we in relation to receiving federal disbursements? Where are we compared to January and June on our local property tax?
That answer it, Cheryl?
Yes, thank you. That doesn't look like a good scenario to me.
It's not. But that's the reality of what school districts have had to face really over the last couple of years.
Okay. Seeing no other questions, thank you very much.